Hello, and welcome to Let's Chat, live from the American Cultural Center, Algiers. I'm Emily Walker from the United States Embassy in Algeria. Today's show is about food, which is everyone's favorite topic, right? But first, I mentioned that I'm in the American Cultural Center, Algiers, or ACCA. We are still closed to the public here, I'm sorry, but our other 4 American Cultural Centers around Algeria are open. Those are located in Oran, Constantine, Ouargla, and Bishar. In fact, Ambassador Aubin was at the American Corner Oran today speaking to students and professors at Oran 1 University. One thing we've been very busy with at the U.S. Embassy is preparing for an upcoming trade fair in Algiers. The U.S. Embassy is the guest of honor at the trade fair, and it's going to be a really awesome week-long event at SAFEX here in Algiers. It's open to the public from June 13th through June 16th. Our outdoor cultural pavilion will have lots of fun things like games, an acrobatic circus troupe, a Grammy award-winning country musician named Chance McCoy, and lots of American food. We're bringing in Chef Rock Harper, who won season 3 of Hell's Kitchen, to do cooking demos and to introduce Algerians to his famous fried chicken sandwich. If you're in Algiers, please come. Again, it's June 13th through 16th. So for today's show, I've lived in Algeria for 3 years now, and I have to say Algerian food is very good. But one thing that I've really missed, that I always miss, is American food. When I tell Algerians that I miss American food, sometimes they'll say, why? Isn't American food just hamburgers? Isn't American food just hot dogs? Isn't it just fast food? And I always say, no, American food is so much more. We have regional dishes that maybe you've never heard of, like gumbo or a Reuben sandwich. Or where I come from, we have this savory hand pie. So it's like a pie you can hold in your hand called a pasty. And then because America is home to people who have immigrated or whose ancestors immigrated from all around the world, we have food with origins from everywhere in the world. Growing up in Detroit, I regularly ate Polish pierogies, Scottish meat pies, Mexican burritos and tacos, spaghetti, ravioli, hummus and baba ganoush from the many Middle Eastern restaurants in the area, Greek salad and gyros from Greek diners, stir-fried Chinese noodle dishes, Indian curries, and more. To me, American food is defined by that variety. And today's guest will talk about that and about what else defines American food. He's an expert. I'd like to welcome to Let's Chat Professor Paul Friedman of Yale University. Professor Friedman studies the history of American cuisine, and he's the author of a book called American Cuisine and How It Got This Way. Professor Friedman, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. I cannot wait to talk about your research into what defines American food. I found your book fascinating. But first, I have to ask, what is your favorite food?
Well, in keeping with what you just said about all the foreign food options available, I guess I'd say my very favorites, well, maybe I'll give you 2. So chili, which is an American ground meat and beans, sometimes stew, that is originally of Mexican influence, is one. And then beef stroganoff, which is slices of beef sauteed with onions and then with sour cream mixed in, more or less Russian or sort of French idea of Russian, but neither of these is like purely American, but that exemplifies exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, I grew up eating both of those dishes too, and I think actually Algerians especially would like beef stroganoff.
I think so too, right.
So you wrote an entire book about what American food is. So what is American food? I understand you have a presentation to show us just what American food is.
That's right. I'll have some slides, but I want to acknowledge the fast food part of it, acknowledge the kind of industrial food part of it, but also concentrate a bit on the things that Emily Walker has mentioned, that is to say, regional and for want of a better word, eclectic or international.
Mhm.
So I'm going to share my screen and start here with a response to that statement. Oh, Americans only eat fast food, or there is no such thing as American cuisine. A response is to say, well, we don't have a national cuisine exactly, but we have many regions, many climate zones, many ecological and environmental, meteorological, that is different climates. So lobster in Maine, for example, this is a lobster. They are found elsewhere, but Maine is the state in the extreme northeast. The borders there, New Brunswick and Quebec, are of course Canada, and the shores of Maine have a huge lobster industry. So that's one. Another would be salmon, a fish found in Alaska and the Northwest waters particularly. It's what it looks like baked. It's a pink fish. And so people would say, oh, you know, what about the salmon of the Northwest? What about lobster? Or barbecue in Texas. These are different kinds of beef sausages, beef shoulder, cooked in a pit very slowly, like for 24, 36 hours until it's extremely tender. Wild rice from Minnesota, so homage to the part of the country that Emily is from. Wild rice is not actually rice, it's a grain that grows in a sort of marshy land, and it looks a little bit like rice, black and white rice, but it is a grain that was a staple to the American Indians, the Native Americans who have lived in Minnesota for millennia, and it remains something that is usually harvested by Native Americans. So all of these things are interesting ingredients, they're regional ingredients, but they don't necessarily make up a cuisine. Like there's no such thing as Maine cuisine or Minnesota cuisine. There might have been 150 years ago, but really what has taken over is a kind of national or industrial food system. Here are some exceptions again, before I get to the industrial food system. I live in New York, or live near New York City, and there is no such thing as New York cuisine. There are New York items like these little round breads, bagels. I don't know if I'd be interested to know how many of my listeners have heard of these. You know, it's not an unfamiliar shape or look, but this is thought of as characteristic of New York. Louisiana in the South is the state that has the most, I would say, intact cuisine. The gumbo that Emily Walker mentioned is a kind of, it's in between a soup and a stew. It can be made with seafood, it can be made with meat, it can be made as here, as a combination, it can be made all vegetables. It's spicy and piquant. The cuisine of this area reflects the influence of France, which colonized Louisiana, but also of the Native American population, the Black slave population, originally enslaved, and a lot of different immigrants. Blue corn tortillas, you see these are Mexican tortillas with stuff on them. This is characteristic of the southwestern United States. Fajitas, stir-fried beef with vegetables and a kind of a Mexican spice system, is characteristic of Texas and New Mexico. But generally speaking, the United States does not fit into a definition of a cuisine offered by the anthropologist Sidney Mintz. He defined cuisine as a distinct set of ingredients and dishes from a particular place and that all classes of society discuss and have opinions about. So it's not just the gourmets or the upper class people who go to restaurants who discuss food. Everybody has an opinion. And so a statement like, oh, my grandmother makes that dish better than you do is an indication of that kind of cuisine. And this is not exactly the way the United States works.
Professor Friedman, if I may, isn't that just partially because the United States is enormous? It's enormous, and each state has people that came from a different place. So how could the United States ever have one type of cuisine?
Well, many places are fairly large, but have a dominant cuisine. So it's not as if Algeria is a small country, admittedly.
Algeria is also huge.
The settlement is concentrated, near the coast. So, but you can have regions and still have a native cuisine. But yeah, sort of the rest of my talk is designed to answer this very pertinent question that you raised. What characterizes the United States, though, even big as it is actually standardization. So you can walk into a supermarket in the northeastern extreme, Maine, and a supermarket in California, and they will look the same. They will have the same standard products, the same kinds of crackers, canned food, breakfast cereal, processed food, the same spices. Maybe you'd have a little bit more Mexican emphasis in Texas or California than in Minnesota or where Emily grew up in Michigan, but not very much. What you would have is a lot of different flavors of the somewhat standardized product. So here's a processed product called rice-a-roni that was very popular when I was a kid and still is sold everywhere. It's a kind of instant rice. And as you see, it comes in many different flavors: chicken, country cheddar, whatever that means, white with butter, Spanish rice, rice pilaf. The American way is for variety of flavors rather than very high quality. In other words, options rather than fanatical attention to detail. Let me just tell a story that involves Italy and my experiences there, but it could easily involve Algeria or many other countries with a well-defined and much discussed cuisine. So my job is not just as a food historian, but I'm a historian of the Middle Ages. I specialize in Spain. And as a medievalist, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Bologna in Italy. And Bologna is famous for its food, even within Italy, which generally is, very competitive about food. And one of the things that Bologna is known for is a pasta stuffed with, a stuffed pasta called a tortellini, which is round and circular, so it's ring-shaped. And I've had tortellini. They're available in the United States, not only at Italian restaurants, but you can buy them at stores. But these were the best tortellini I've ever had. I mean, they were clearly better than the standard that I was accustomed to. And my host said, these tortellini, tortellini are sometimes made in other cities of Italy with vegetables or cheese or mushrooms. And I said, this is a typically American question, oh, do you ever get tired of meat tortellini? And, just experiment with spinach tortellini. And my host looked at me like I was crazy, like I was suggesting an orthodox or heretical opinion. He said, no, we're in Bologna. In Bologna, we eat meat tortellini. That's the end of the story. In the United States, at my supermarket, there are 8 different kinds of tortellini. I just counted them the day before yesterday. But they don't taste as good as the ones in Bologna because they're made in a factory. And even if they weren't, people here don't have, except for a few kinds of products, like pizza, where I teach in New Haven. New Haven is famous for pizza, and people discuss that, but they don't actually make it at home. So Italy, like Algeria, at least my understanding of Algeria, is a place where people have a repertoire of dishes, and they pay a lot of attention to how those dishes are made, and they're not very interested in novelty. Americans love novelty, and they have tended to like processed foods that are both, like this rice-a-roni, it's standard. That is, it's an industrial product. You can get it anywhere in the United States, but it comes in many different flavors. So first of all,
to explain to our Algerian audience maybe what this is. So obviously there's rice in Algeria, and I think it's pretty popular, but it would just be a bag of rice, you know?
yeah,
Rice
it's a bag of rice. It's instant rice. That is, you heat it and it'll cook with the flavors already in it.
Exactly.
So these kinds of processed products, you know, where you don't buy rice in a, you buy this little kit, as it were, has been typical of the United States for over 100 years. Americans have loved the apparent, and I say apparent because it's not always genuine, but apparent convenience. These things are very cheap. The industrial food system has meant that the average American spends 15% of the family income on food, which is very small. And so this kind of wealth was featured by the US State Department, and particularly during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So here is a photograph from a trade exhibit in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, 1957, I believe. And it shows a typical American housewife unpacking groceries. They're all wrapped up. Even in 1957, it wouldn't have been quite this much. But you know, the bread is not bought from a bakery. It's wrapped up. It's a factory bread. And you can see the meat is all wrapped up, and there doesn't seem to be any fresh produce. But this was something to boast about. This was the cornucopia, that is the plenitude of food available to the average person without their sacrificing, you know, a huge percentage of their income to acquire it. The other aspect of variety, so I'm talking about variety and standardization, is what Emily mentioned before. That is the various kinds of cuisines available. The most popular foreign cuisine in the United States is Chinese, and that has been the case since the 1890s. I have this photograph because this restaurant, called the Pekin Noodle House, is the oldest Chinese restaurant in the United States under continuous operation. It was founded in 1911, and it's in a town called Butte in the state of Montana in the northwestern United States. Chop suey is a typical product of the American interaction with other countries, in that it was an adaptation of a Chinese dish that appealed to Americans so much that Americans in the first part of the 20th century could not get enough of it. It was one of the most popular dishes there was, and now it's kind of discredited or forgotten because it's inauthentic. So Americans want foreign food that's authentic, but they also want it to conform to our particular kinds of tastes. So
how can you get both of those things? Those seem like—
How do you get, well, chop suey has a Chinese flavor, but it doesn't have organ meat. Americans don't like organ meat for reasons that I'd be glad to discuss when we have our question and answer period. The sauce is thicker than it would be in China, more like a gravy. A lot of Chinese food in the United States is sweeter than it would be in China, because Americans actually like that kind of combination of sweet, spicy, and salty. Here is the cover of one of the most popular magazines in the United States to this day, called The New Yorker. And this is from the late 1930s. So it shows that already then, New York in particular, but the country in general, was identified with different kinds of food. At the top left is their idea of Japanese food. And then there are a number of dishes in the little white labels. Then to the right is Middle Eastern food. So things like shish kebab. Then Scandinavian food. They're serving themselves a cold table with different little dishes called a smorgasbord that was very popular at one time. Russian, below that German, below that Chinese, below that Jewish, and at the bottom Italian. So these are the ideas that Americans have of foreign cuisines. What about French cuisine? So French cuisine is not only the dominant force in colonial Algeria, but worldwide. At one time, French cuisine, at one time meaning before about 1980, French cuisine defined the high-end cuisine of the world. Well, how the mighty have fallen. Here is a sign from Poitiers in France. It says authentic French. That's meant to be sarcastic. Obviously, the place is called Tacos and Company. Tacos are Mexican and not French. They also have burgers, American, panini, Italian. So if this has...
Friedman, if I could interject, because tacos in Algeria, I discovered when I moved here 3 years ago, I saw all these signs that said tacos, and I thought, oh, good, because Americans love Mexican food. Americans love Mexican tacos, but they're not actually Mexican tacos here. It's actually the French tacos are popular in Algeria, where they are a kind of a sandwich, a wrap sandwich that's been grilled, and it's like filled with bechamel sauce and meat usually, sometimes stuffed with French fries too. And it's grilled, so it's like it's a sandwich. It has nothing to do with a Mexican taco.
Yeah, of course, our idea of a Mexican taco may not be exactly the same as Mexico either. Sure. And of course, all of these things have been exported from America. So it's not as if, even though France and Italy share a border, they got the panini from Italy. They got all of this stuff from the United States. If they had sushi here or pizza, it would also come via the United States. So it's not that McDonald's has taken over the world. It's not that fast food has taken over the world. It's that this mixture, this eclecticism is what has been exported. Mm-hmm. Now, high-end French food that was dominant in the aristocratic and bourgeois world for hundreds of years are things like this, foie gras en galantine. So, this is a meat ground and then covered with a kind of aspic or gelatin, and then a kind of something. To make this requires an unbelievable amount of skill and very expensive ingredients. The finest restaurant in the United States, the most prestigious restaurant in the United States from 1940 until 1970 was called Le Pavillon in New York. And here is its owner, Henri Soulet, sampling caviar. French cuisine was the highest cuisine in the United States, but it was also dominant in the sort of European world at the time of the hegemony of European power. So here is a menu from Shanghai in 1921. And there's no Chinese ingredient in here. The pâté de foie gras de Strasbourg, baked snipe with Saratoga chips, roast fillet of turkey with cranberry sauce. This is partly American and partly French. Here's a menu from what's now Jakarta, Indonesia, from 1910, from the fanciest hotel there. And the menu is in French, and it's all completely French. There's no accommodation to the climate of Jakarta. They didn't have air conditioning in 1910, but so what? They're going to have these extremely hearty escalope de riz de veau à la Villeroi, right? Sweetbreads with this rich kind of thick French sauce. Well, you get the idea. And in New York as well, here is a menu from a restaurant called the Café Martin in 1912. And some of it is kind of American sirloin, but it's more or less French inspired and French influenced. The first real restaurant in the United States, which still stands, called Delmonico's in downtown New York, was created as a French restaurant. Here's the first menu that we have from 1838. And it's like 15 pages, very long, detailed menu. In French, it's called a restaurant français. Delmonico is not a French name. Indeed, these brothers, les frères Delmonico, were from Switzerland, from the Italian part of Switzerland at that. But this is true of restaurants in the United States to this day. So there are lots of Italian restaurants. Many of them in my part of the country are owned by people from Albania. So there are different niches that immigrant groups have. Another French restaurant is in New Orleans, back to Louisiana, which we looked at earlier. This is as old as Delmonico's, 1840. It's called Antoine's. And the food it serves is actually that of New Orleans, but it is, it's really, it presents itself as French. I would say that one of the great stories of the culinary world in the last 40, 50 years is the eclipse of French food as the international standard of what elite dining is. In France itself, I mean, to go back to that Tacos and Company sign, when I said how the mighty have fallen, if you look at 1965, just for example, in 1965, the Michelin Guide to France for the Paris section, there are 323 restaurants listed. All of them, except for 6, are French. Logically, I mean, you're in France. Some of the, there are different French provinces, different French cuisines, some seafood restaurants, but there are only 6 foreign restaurants. I think 1 Vietnamese, 3 North African, and that's how they're described. So Tunisian, Algerian, or Moroccan, and that's it. That doesn't mean that there were no restaurants other than those. There were lots of people from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia living in France at that time, but it wasn't thought that the tourist or that the French, born person would be interested in them. And this is a difference from the United States. In 1965, the New York Times put out a guide to restaurants in New York City. New York Times, the leading newspaper of New York. And it had very few American restaurants. Of its starred 3-star restaurants, the highest category, like the Guide Michelin, 6 of the 7 were French. And they had names like La Caraval, Le Pavillon, La Cygne, La Chambertin, Le Chambord. Right? So you can see that times have certainly changed. So I have found, as I think Emily was describing, that being away from home teaches you a lot about what your cuisine really is because of what you miss. A lot of Americans miss things that most of the rest of the world doesn't like. Peanut butter. I don't know how familiar you are with this, probably not, because it's something that most people outside of the United States don't like, but Americans tend to miss it. So for me, the 2 experiences I had living abroad for more than a couple of weeks were Indonesia, when I was a college student, and Spain, where I did my doctoral dissertation research. And yeah, in both of these places, I missed breakfast most of all. That's partly because the American breakfast is very different, and partly maybe because when you wake up, you're most fragile or nostalgic or homesick. But anyway, that was my experience. I often ask foreign students at my university what they miss from home, what food they miss. And it's usually something very basic, like bread. You know, the bread here, I don't like it. There's something wrong with it. Or the rice doesn't seem to be, I don't like it with, you know, these very long grains, or it doesn't seem to have any taste. Sometimes it's the style of eating. So I have students, particularly from places like Bangladesh, where they're used to eating with their right hand, and they find the fork and knife kind of, it's not like I'm really eating somehow. On the other hand, many new arrivals in the United States are enchanted by the quantity of food available and its variety. Immigrants.
Great quantity of food in the United States.
Yeah. Too much in certain respects. You get letters home from immigrants from Italy, for example, in the 19th century, about, you know, eating meat 3 times a week. And then they would say, oh yeah, my relatives in the old country thought I was lying. You can't be eating. You're just trying to make us feel bad. And so I gave up telling them what I was eating because they just wouldn't believe me. So I guess to conclude, abundance, the regional traditions, the erosion of regional traditions, standardization, and variety. These are the things that interact in the history of American cuisine. So I'd be very interested in questions or comments, and thank you for showing up, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Friedman. That was interesting, and just a small snippet of your book, What is American Food and How It Got This Way? If anyone can access his book online, I highly recommend it. Tons of information in there. I'm interested in asking you about, there's so much food that's influenced by immigrants who came. You mentioned that Chinese food is the #1 most popular foreign food that's in the United States. But when all of these immigrants were first coming to the US, weren't they just cooking in their homes? So how did the food kind of spread? How did other people in America learn about Chinese food, learn about Mexican food? Were all these immigrants opening restaurants right away, or how did this proliferation happen?
A lot of immigrants opened restaurants to serve other immigrants, particularly in the Chinese case, because most of the people who came were men. They did not bring their families until much later. And so there was a ready market for restaurants of men who didn't either know how to cook or preferred not to serve them the food of home. The key moment is when non-Chinese people show up at restaurants and are curious about the food. The same thing happens with Italian restaurants, even though Italians tended to come with their families. But nevertheless, there were some restaurants just, in case, you didn't want to eat at home. These people who were curious about the cuisine of others were young people living in cities, usually not married yet, and with some money to spend. They're called bohemians in the 19th century after the famous La Vie de Bohème. So that means sort of artistic people or people with a non-conformist, experimentalist bent. And so these people thought Italian food was fun and a change from the stodgy American cuisine they were used to, or they thought that Chinese food was exotic. And again, the love of novelty and innovation. The restaurant owners very quickly made their restaurants much more let's say, user-friendly to Americans. And the reason for that is there were more Americans, generic Americans, than immigrants. If you have a Chinese restaurant, yes, you could just be very authentic and have it for Chinese people. And there are some, but they're only, I would guess, maybe 5% of all the Chinese restaurants, because there's much more money to be made by serving a larger and much more predictable clientele. The same thing goes for almost every cuisine, foreign cuisine in the United States that has been successful.
Thank you for that. We have a question from L. Oddly. So you mentioned that everything that American food is, it's from all of these different cultures influenced. L. Oddly asks, is there a 100% American food?
Yes, I'd say clam chowder. So this is a thick soup made with clams and potatoes. Cooked oysters. So oysters are popular in Europe, but usually raw. So cooked oysters are very American. I mentioned peanut butter, maple syrup, except that it's shared with Canada, but it's a North American food. But a lot of things that are thought of as 100% American, like the hamburger, are not. The hamburger, by its very name, is a German invention, and there's a lot of debates about the beginnings of it, but the hot dog is a Frankfurter. It's a kind of sausage from the city in Germany of Frankfurt. So there's a lot of kind of hidden German food, unacknowledged German food behind the supposedly typically American dishes.
A question from Itzinia Lee. They ask, what do you think about French cuisine being brought to the US just for the elite, just for the very high classes?
Well, I love French cuisine and miss some of these fancy restaurants. Not that, I would go to them all the time. What's odd is that in that New Yorker cover that showed all these foreign foods, foreign cuisines, they did not have French. That's because French was not foreign. French was just haute cuisine. So, Chinese food is what used to be called ethnic cuisine. That is the food of immigrants who are presumed to be less rich than the person dining at the restaurant who's not from that immigrant group. Whereas French food had a certain kind of high status. So I don't miss these status differentials. The United States is a bit more egalitarian, at least in spirit, than in the past. But these restaurants were delightful. They had very good food, and it's very hard to find that now.
Mm-hmm. I think they might have also been asking, because I feel like I've heard this before, that French food maybe became popular in the United States because diplomats and dignitaries hired French chefs. So very rich people hired French chefs, and they were the only ones eating it. But are you saying that it's actually French food had more of an influence than just being for the elite?
Right. I think the elite were certainly sold on it. The White House in state dinners until really the 1970s. The menus were in French. The Kennedys, for example, had a famous French chef. But my father, for example, who died at the age of 94, for his 90th birthday, we went to a restaurant. The restaurant that my father had really liked, the French restaurant, had closed. But there was one restaurant, which it too is now closed, where you could get certain things that he loved, but that are now extremely hard to find. One was lobster à l'américaine. So lobster, that first slide I had, made in a kind of sauce that has tomatoes. Hence, there's a lot of debate about why it's called à l'américaine. And quenelle, a pike quenelle, that is a fish in kind of balls, mashed up and cooked with, I think there are different kinds of sauces. So quenelle de pochet and homard à l'américaine. And, my father was certainly not a poor person, but not a member of the, elite that you're describing. But I think he was genuinely pleased and touched, because I think he knew how difficult it was to find a French restaurant, period, and a French restaurant that still made these dishes in particular.
Interesting. There's a comment by Lali Layola, who says, I think the thing I like about some American food is that they cook about 3 or 4 different things, then they eat a little bit of everything. In Algeria, it's often one big plate of food. It's one dish. It's not so much the different things. So I think that speaks to the variety that you were talking about, that we like both to have a lot of variety, and sometimes we like to have a lot of variety on our plate for a single meal.
Yes. I think Americans also like what's called sometimes comically grazing, because grazing is what animals do. They sort of nibble at this bunch of grass and then go on to another one. Grazing means little snacks. Americans tend not to sit down to large meals as much as just eat sort of all day. Not a practice I recommend, because it's not very healthful. But some other cuisines, though, have lots of little plates. So in Scandinavia, this smorgasbord that I mentioned before, or tapas in Spain. But yes, this is part of American variety. That observation is correct.
You mentioned in your book also that Americans abroad, people who live not in America, have the perception that Americans maybe don't enjoy a meal as much as they should, that they eat on the run, that they grab a sandwich and eat it in the street, they drink the coffee in the street. Do you think that's true? Do other countries enjoy meals more than Americans?
I think it's true. I wouldn't make too much of it. It is true to the extent that even in the early 19th century, foreign travelers from Europe remarked that Americans eat very quickly. They eat a lot of food. They don't like to converse over food. They seem to regard eating as a chore rather than as a pleasure. And this is true of a lot of the American outlook about food. So, for example, former President Gerald Ford once said that he thought that sleeping and eating were a waste of time. I mean, they're biologically necessary. You can't get rid of them. But he had the same thing for lunch every day. It was a very boring lunch, so we wouldn't have to think about it. That seems to be a denial of one of the great pleasures of life. And many of those pleasures are things that come around often, every day in this case. So, yeah, I mean, Americans are more likely to do something else during a meal. This is spreading, lots of people check their phones while they're eating. It's, I think, a terrible habit. But having said it's a terrible habit, I've been known to do it myself.
But what if while you're eating a delicious meal, you're looking at pictures of delicious food on your phone? Then is it okay?
That's or you're eating a not delicious meal.
There you go.
Or you've got all these pictures and you watch the Food Network, but the food that you actually eat is of inferior quality.
Yes, because you don't have a food stylist styling your plate to make yours perfect.
I guess not. Or you're not willing to invest the time and effort.
Yes. So there's a comment in here from K24 who says, I would love to see Professor Friedman in Algeria researching and reporting on the diversity of Algerian cuisine.
Oh, I'd love that too. May it happen.
Have you traveled to North Africa before?
To Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
I acknowledge that that's very different, but yeah, I have been to Morocco, and that's the food from North Africa that Americans are most familiar with. So there are, a certain number of restaurants that describe themselves as Moroccan. yeah, in New York and elsewhere.
Well, we'll wrap up here in just a few minutes. If anyone else has a question for Professor Friedman, please ask it in the YouTube chat. And I would like to ask you, Professor Friedman, so you talked about the industrialization of food, how food in America, a lot of it is produced in factories. This means that we can have lots of varieties, lots of different flavors of yogurt and lots of different flavors of rice. But it seems to me that, at least in some areas, people are moving away from that. People are valuing more food that's grown in their own community. We might call it the locavore movement, people like food that's really grown in their city practically, and that's grown in season. Do you see that as a major trend in America?
I do. And, I had more time, I would have discussed that. Certainly since 1970, there's been much more attention to where food comes from, both for environmental and health reasons, but also, so where I live, asparagus has just finished its season. And it's wonderful grown here. Asparagus, however, is now available all year round from Peru, from Mexico. It's not as good because it has to come from a long distance and has to be grown, kind of almost as an industrial product. There are more markets where you can buy things that farmers grow. There's more attention to where things come from, and there's more appreciation of quality. So yes, that's right. It hasn't yet become dominant, but it is growing every year.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. One of the reasons that I wanted to have you on the show and to talk about this, as I mentioned, is because a lot of Algerians I've interacted with in the past few years seem to think that American food is just fast food. So I think you've dispelled the notion that it's just fast food. It certainly is fast food also. That is very popular in America, but I think that you've painted a picture that American food is very complicated and rich. There's a lot.
Yeah, complicated in an interesting way, I hope. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your astute conversation. That was a real pleasure. Thank you for everyone who watched on YouTube. Please do subscribe, hit the red subscribe button on YouTube so you don't miss chats like this. We do these chats most Wednesdays at 6 p.m., although we will not be doing one next week, but we hope to pick up after that. Thank you everyone for watching. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.